particular kind of American English. Not a particularly pleasant voice, but I hope clear. I can also say howdy. As you'll hear, I come from Denver, Colorado, but was originally from Brooklyn, New York, but I don't sound like Brooklyn. You should probably be grateful for that. Hello? Hi.
I think it's still too far.
Or I'm too far. It's too far, I'm too far. Is that working better? Yeah, now I can hear a little bit of reverberation, and I hate electronically amplified or otherwise conveyed sound, but I guess that's the rule here. We do have this beautiful apparatus. Another minute or two, or what's your pleasure? Shouldn't keep these good people waiting.
Dobar dan svima, dobrodošli na treće decembarsko predavanje koje organizuje Centar za helenske studije u okviru projekta Helenska demokratija i savremeni svijet i drugo i posljednje predavanje profesora Viktora Kastelanija, našeg gosta sa Univerziteta u Denveru iz Kolorada, Sjedinjenih Američkih Država. Ako su neki od vas bili juče, on je juče govorio o Aristofanovoj kritici klemenske demokratije, a ono o čemu će nam danas govoriti su određeni primjeri, odnosno tačnije 4 slučaja, tako reći, direktne demokratije u Atini u 5. vijeku prije nove ere i ono što će biti suština, a što ćete vidjeti tokom predavanja i do kraja predavanja, jeste da ta direktna demokratija u Atini nije baš uvijek bila toliko dobra i povoljna kao što bi se moglo zamisliti. Već sam rekao juče, ali za vas koji niste bili, profesor Castellani je profesor klasičnih nauka na Univerzitetu u Denveru, inače je doktorirao na Princetonu, vrlo je čest gost mnogih evropskih i stranih zemalja i upravo je ovo dio jedne njegove, tako reći, balkanske turneje, jer je bio u Sarajevu, u Bihaću i u Beogradu i evo ga sad u Podgorici. Tako da ne odlažemo dalje. Imate riječ, you have the floor.
Well, thank you. Thank you all for being here. I hope you will get something from this. This is my last, and in some ways maybe, my best offering on this whole lecture tour. But you will judge whether it's good, let alone whether it's better than anything else. Direct democracy in classical Athens. 4 case studies from the 5th century. It's reported that late during a second year of open warfare against Athens' mainland enemies, an elected Athenian strategos, a general, or more literally, armed force leader, said, "I expected this outbreak of anger against me." In that year, too, of what we call the Peloponnesian War, the Spartans, the Corinthians, and their neighbors to the south in the Peloponnese, and the Boeotians of Thebes to the north were the enemy. Corinth was interfering with some of Athens' coastal allies. Spartans had twice ravaged the Attic countryside as Athenian citizens by the tens of thousands stood helplessly behind or atop the impregnable walls of the city, even seeing smoke from enemy arson as homes and farm buildings burned. "Since I understand," he went on to say, "the reasons for it, and I have called an assembly with this object in view, to remind you of your previous resolutions and to put forward my own case against you. You are attacking me for having spoken in favor of war and yourselves for having voted for it." At the brink of that war, he had persuaded the all-citizen sovereign assembly, ecclesia, to declare that 30 years peace of 446 BC The Athenians and the allies, most of them, in fact, tributary subjects, could join battles by land and especially by sea. The peace was broken. That general was distinguished for strengthening the Athenian 200 battleship navy, which had achieved and maintained supremacy on Aegean and Ionian seas. He had, in fact, urged the Athenians, even those who lived far outside the walls of the city, the impregnable long walls that protected Athens city and the way down to its ports on the Saronic Gulf, to behave as if their fortifications made their polis an island. They should sacrifice indefensible farms whose diverse produce could instead be replaced by imports over the waters that Athens secured. In the winter of 431 BC, he urged war resolutions. These declared that because of violations by Athens' enemies, they, the enemies, had abrogated the peace of 446 halfway through its intended 30-year term. Back then, as the war was beginning, he said, "Athenians, my views are the same as ever. I am against making any concessions to the Peloponnesians, even though I am aware that the enthusiastic state of mind in which people are persuaded to enter upon a war is not retained when it comes to action, and that people's minds are altered by the course of events. I call upon all of you who are persuaded by my words to give your full support to these resolutions which we are making all together, and to abide by them, even if in some respect or other we find ourselves in difficulty." Later in that war, in its 5th year, another elected general, one of the annual 10, but like the other one, the most influential Athenian leader of the day, gave another speech that Thucydides likewise reconstructs. That man believed debate had been unwisely reopened about how to punish rebellious Mytilene. Dominant on the large, rich island Lesbos, the city Mytilene was one of the handful of allied city-states that had kept their own small navies and enjoyed other privileges within imperial Athens' Delian League. The Mytileneans, their upper class, having gained control of government with the help of mercenary soldiers, rebelled against Athenian hegemony, proposed to leave the no longer voluntary league, and even negotiated toward alliance with Sparta. This man's angry tirade began so: "Personally, I have had occasion often enough already to observe that a democracy is incapable of governing others. You fail to see that when you allow rebels to persuade you to make a mistaken decision, and when you give way to your own feelings of compassion, you are being guilty of a kind of weakness which is dangerous to you and which will not make them love you anymore." Both imperialist leaders, generals, quoted above, were advocates of realpolitik. The first had said to his fellow citizens that your empire is now like a tyranny. It may have been wrong to take it. It is certainly dangerous to let it go. The second said, what you do not realize is that your empire is a tyranny, exercised over subjects who do not like it and who are always plotting against you. That first speaker, of course, beginning of the war, was Pericles, whom Thucydides, the historian, idolized. The second, Cleon, whom the historian detested, pronouncing him remarkable among the Athenians for the violence of his character. The historian praises the former, Pericles, for exemplary statesmanship that was really benevolent monarchy. His scarcely contested leadership since the late 440s was due to his extraordinary power to sway the ecclesia, which enacted laws and decided policy conforming to his supremely pragmatic and wise judgment. He worked comfortably with a council, bulle, that prepared agenda for the assembly. The Olympian, as Pericles was called by both friend and political foe, could rouse and encourage the citizens when they were dispirited, could temper their energy when it might lead them off the prudent course he was plotting for the demos, nation, people of the Athenians, as his city-state named itself. In year 2 of his war, Pericles needed to boost his fellow citizens' morale. Not only had many farms been damaged or even quite ruined by enemies, whose heavy infantry enjoyed land supremacy even in Attica, but a terrible plague had decimated citizens crowded together within the long walls. Their leader needed to rein in the suffering people's regrets, the satisfactory progress of the war from his big picture perspective notwithstanding. In the last of 3 remarkable speeches that Thucydides puts into Pericles' mouth, the one I quoted at the beginning of my talk, he so reassured them of his wisdom and incorruptibility that they stayed the course and sent no peace mission to Sparta. In fact, after they angrily vented their distress and convicted him of harm to the polis and fined him heavily, amazingly, they re-elected him to generalship. Moreover, Thucydides says, more even than before, they put all their affairs into his hands. This first case has demonstrated how volatile was the temper of that ecclesia who made laws and unmade them, reversed policy in successive decades, within a year or two, even from one day to the next. Dante Alighieri was scandalized if the commune of Florence changed law from month to month. Here, it's day to day, almost morning to afternoon. The several thousands of citizens in the sovereign assembly hardly regarded themselves as bound by previous decisions, predecessors' decisions, or their own, by reasoning that those decisions, by the demos sovereign will, had themselves either instituted something new or changed something. No Supreme Court existed to check their reckless disregard of past principles or pertinent precedents. Their will remained sovereign at every scheduled assembly meeting or any specially added one. Whether what they resolved or codified was in accordance with nomos, law in a broad sense, more legality than prescription, or against law, was for orator politicians to argue, for jurymen in the large demotic courts or voters in the assembly to determine. The matter of constitutionality will be important for the 4th of my case studies. But now, to the 2nd. We turn to Cleon. The day before his speech quoted in Thucydides' Book 3, at Cleon's motion, a virtual death sentence was voted upon the rebel state Mytilene, surrendered by a desperate faction who opened the gates after a long and terrible siege of the city. Cleon moved that all Mytilenean men be executed, women and children sold into slavery, that the walls of their city be razed to discourage relapsed rebellion, their ships added to the Athenian navy. Their rich land would be subdivided and allocated by lottery, kleros, to poor Athenian citizens. That was that, or was it? The council, Boule, was persuaded, by whom we cannot say, to call an unscheduled assembly the very next day to reconsider this drastic verdict. Usually, Cleon was able to intimidate the council by threatening criminal charges or personal lawsuits against influential members. This time, however, he was foiled. At that special session of the assembly, Cleon offered this assessment of legislative policy. We should realize that a city is better off with bad laws, so long as they remain fixed, than with good laws that are constantly being altered. That lack of learning combined with good common sense is more helpful than the kind of cleverness that gets out of hand. And that as a general rule, states are better governed by the man in the street than by intellectuals. He accused speakers who urged the demos to mitigate their yesterday's harshness of being either A, sophisticated but unprincipled entertainers, deft at playing upon emotions like pity, or B, bribed hirelings of wealthy Mytileneans, or maybe both, clever speakers and bribed men. You, Cleon told the all-citizen body, are simply victims of your own pleasure in listening, and are more like an audience sitting at the feet of a professional lecturer than a parliament discussing matters of state. This second case involved not just anonymous opponents, such as those who accused Pericles, but a spokesman whom Thucydides names, Diodotus, a person equally as unknown as his father Eucrates. He might as well have been anonymous. Others, whom Thucydides' account omits, must have spoken both for and against moderation. To this Diodotus, however, the historian Thucydides ascribes a remarkable, profoundly amoral speech. Diodotus addressed the assembly after Cleon, whose harangue had attempted to refute a following speaker's anticipated plea for compassion, for leniency. But Diodotus answered Cleon otherwise. He acknowledged that anger over Mytilene's treachery and injustice, as he called it, had motivated the decision of the day before. Justified anger. Compassion, he argued, should no more move them today than it did yesterday. Nor, however, should indignation move them if harshness is not advantageous. He declared that it would be more useful to Athens if most Mytileneans were allowed to live and work and engage in trade, earning and paying hefty cash tribute to Athens. Farmers should be made to pay rent for that land whose ownership would pass to needy Athenians. Only the guilty upper class should be executed, the masses forgiven, since in fact they may not have been culpable at all. The many had been bullied by the well-armed few and their mercenaries into acquiescing in rebellion. Members of the Mytilenean demos, the common people, had in fact opened city gates to the Athenians, ending the siege of the place. Were they to be punished for that favor? Perhaps Diodotus' most powerful argument, sad to say, was that if Athens did exterminate the entire population of Mytilene, high and low in social and economic class, she would make imperialism harder for herself. When other allied subject cities rebelled in the future, as they inevitably would do, whenever they entertained high hopes of success, like the Mytilenean rebels just now, the doom of Mytilene would prevent them from ever surrendering. Athens would be hard-pressed to keep any future siege going till the last rebel was slain, and then would take over an empty land. That land could contribute no men, no ships, no silver to her war effort. Moreover, democratic Athens' natural friends in allied city-states, the demos of each, might turn against the slaughterers of their classmates and defect to the anti-Athenian coalition that Sparta led. In fact, after Diodotus made this unedifying appeal, an ugly compromise was reached. He and those who agreed with him could not save all of the rebels, nor preserve Mytilene's economic autonomy. The Athenians' wrath was appeased by the slaughter of only 1,000 or more of the few, of the Mytilenean few. Many thousand others, the many, were spared, though reduced to sharecroppers or cash-paying tenants on properties that now would belong to largely absentee Athenians. The third case again examines competing efforts to unpersuade and re-persuade the sovereign assembly about a decided matter. Speakers revisited the Athenians' resolution to circumvent the 50-year peace of Nicias, 421 BC, in its 6th year, violating at least its spirit, if not its very letter. By launching an armada to interfere in Sicilian interstate conflicts, one general protested, they would invite their balky allies in the Aegean region to revolt and their sullen mainland enemies to restart the Peloponnesian War. Athens would run exactly that kind of risk against which, according to Thucydides, Pericles had long before expressly warned his compatriots. You should feel confident in ultimate victory, Pericles had advised them, if only you will make up your minds not to add to the empire while the war is in progress, and not to go out of your way to involve yourselves in new perils. Thucydides unusually gives Nicias, the aforementioned prominent general, who had negotiated the peace treaty that informally bears his name, Peace of Nicias, gives him 2 speeches in a debate over whether to rescind the preceding day's resolution. The assembly resolved to send an expeditionary force west so as to assist beckoning non-Hellenic Aegistians and the people of the Antini, the Aegistians against a Greek city at the west end of Sicily, and the Leontinians against Syracuse that had driven them from their city in the southeast of Sicily. Neither group, the Aegistians, barbarians, nor Leontinians, was per se a worthwhile ally for Athens to acquire. Their real value was to provide Athens with pretext for intervention in Sicilian affairs. Nicias' first speech that Thucydides quotes tries, Pericles-like, as we have seen, to restrain excessive imperial ambition of the Athenians. He argues that, although technically Athens remained at peace, she had dangerous enemies close to home who had already been provoked by Athenian diplomatic maneuvers in recent years and were eager to resume fighting. Some subject allies were already in revolt, and with certain unfriendly states in the Aegean region, Athens was only in precarious, short-term, frequently renewed, armistice. These problems should be resolved before Athens undertook new hostilities to the west, across the Ionian Sea, against populous city-states that will be hard to conquer and even harder to control so far from Attica. Nicias further warned about personal overreaching by his younger colleague Alcibiades, glamorous, brilliant, bold, controversial, who with Nicias was named one of 3 generals who would lead the proposed, but not yet fully commissioned and funded, Sicilian expedition. In his first speech, Nicias used unabashed ad hominem attack, though he did not deign to name its target. "It is with real alarm," he said, "that I see this young man's party sitting at his side in this assembly, all called in to sit with him and among you, to support him. And I, on my side, call for the support of the older men among you. If any one of you is sitting next to one of his supporters, do not allow yourself to be browbeaten or be frightened of being called a coward if you do not vote for war. Do not, like them, indulge in hopeless passions for what is not there. Our country is now on the verge of the greatest danger she has ever faced." Nicias thus tried to split old from young voters, thinking that those closer in age to himself would still be war-weary and must distrust wanton, scandalous Alcibiades. However, as Thucydides explains, many older citizens believe that General Nicias' legendary good fortune and his characteristic caution would at least prevent disaster. However, success was what they expected. Conquest of Syracuse and her Sicilian and Greek Italiote neighbors, tacit goal of the audacious enterprise, would permit their generation, like that of Pericles, to add to the wealth and power of the state, not just timidly maintain it, and guarantee their diverse cash subsidies from increased imperial revenues. Younger men who would actually do the sailing and rowing, the fighting on land and on sea, and, as they too expected, the conquering, were eager for adventure. In his second speech, Nicias declared that if, despite his grave reservations, the expedition did proceed, it must be huge and costly. Spelling out its needs, he hoped that the assembly would be put off by the price. On the contrary, they voted everything he asked for, offering to authorize even more if the commanding generals sought it. Between Nicias' 2 speeches comes one of Thucydides' most extraordinary compositions. Alcibiades' measured, even respectful reply to Nicias is as brilliant as the speaker, familiar to many readers and probably to many of you from Plato's Symposium. Like Pericles, Alcibiades was not shy about claiming to be exceptional. Still only in his early 30s, he is as brash can be. It is quite, I should speak with a speech impediment, but I don't think I know exactly what his speech impediment was, but he had a charming lisp or something. It is quite natural for my fellow citizens to envy me for the magnificence with which I have done things in Athens, such as providing choruses, and so on. Yet to the outside world, this is also evidence of our strength. Indeed, this is a very useful kind of folly, when a man spends his own money, not only to benefit himself, but his city as well. People like this, all in fact, whose brilliance in any direction has made them prominent, are unpopular in their lifetimes, especially with their equals and with others with whom they come in contact. But with posterity, you'll find people claiming relationship with them, even when none exists. And you will find their countries boasting of them, not as though they were strangers or disreputable, but as fellow countrymen and doers of great deeds. This is what I aim at being myself. And because of this, my private life comes in for criticism. But the point is whether you have anyone who deals with public affairs better than I do. His peroration, long speech, ends this way. Do not be put off by Nicias' arguments for non-intervention and his distinctions between the young and the old. Make it your endeavor to raise his city, our city, to even greater heights, realizing that neither youth nor age can do anything without the other, but that the greatest strength is developed when one has a combination, where all sorts are represented, the inferior types, the ordinary types, and the profoundly calculating types, all together. My view is that a city which is active by nature will soon ruin itself if it changes its nature and becomes idle, and that the way that men find their greatest security is in accepting the character and the institutions which they actually have, even if they're not perfect, and in living as nearly as possible in accordance with their character. And the Athenians were famous for their activity, even their hyperactivity. He won his points. Nicias could only enlarge, not prevent, the hubristic expedition. The cynicism of Alcibiades' flattering exhortations to the entire people of Athens became striking afterward. Under threat of capital prosecution by personal and political enemies, Alcibiades defected to Sparta and disclosed his contempt for Athenian democracy there. Nevertheless, at home, he had been a popular personality, irresistible in a smart rhetoric that was graced by stunning physical handsomeness and a charming speech defect that actors love to mimic, that kind of naughty celebrity who enrages many but delights many more. He led Athens cheerfully, hopefully, to catastrophe, the Sicilian expedition. Fourth case is a complex of constitutional confusion, sensational emotional appeal, and self-serving personal vendetta and opportunism, all of which exploited that dangerous, irresponsible sovereignty of the Athenian ecclesia. Moreover, it all took place under stress of a war going very badly for the disintegrating imperial range of Athenian power, even though the immediate issue concerned aftermath of a rare major and potentially consequential victory at sea, where Athens remained strong. A complex political-legal crisis arose in 406 BC after the Athenians won the biggest naval battle of the war at Arginusae, off the coast of Lesbos. We have an account of this affair, not from Thucydides, but from Thucydides' continuator, Xenophon, a too often disparaged contemporary of Plato, a clear thinker whose chief fault is that he wasn't Plato. During the course of several days' contention and confusion, the assembly, licensed, it seems, by the agenda-setting council, voted to suspend the city-state's laws and, such as they were, constitutional precedents regarding judicial procedure. They did so at the urging of demagogues who were pursuing their own agenda, which, in the case of two popular ship captains, was to divert blame for their own failure to save Athenian sailors swimming from wrecked and sinking ships, or at least to recover their bodies and bring them home for funeral rites. Outraged relatives of the sailors lost 25 triremes times 200 rowers for each equals 5,000, most of them evidently drowned. And the countless others who sympathized with all of the bereaved citizens were deaf to excuses about unseasonable stormy weather and unusually heavy seas that prevented the recovery. Time today permits only a quick outline derived from Xenophon's Book 1 of the Hellenica that lists, my list, with comments, successive contradictory actions of the volatile sovereign assembly. First resolution, to bypass the constituted courts and try illegally altogether en bloc before the ecclesia 8 generals, 2 in absentia, 6 under arrest in Athens, for failing to save the drowning, or at very least to recover their drowned bodies for state funerals. Notorious offenders in the past, even conspirators against Athens and her democracy, had always before been tried one by one, even if they were several. Second resolution, to conduct an illegal, unconstitutional collective trial in a single autumn day. This would not give the accused the customary lengthy defense speeches one at a time. On the other hand, the assembly adjourned its irregular meeting, its trial, without a verdict when night fell. The process was slowed down by the council. After a break for religious holidays and much sensational agitation in the meantime, the council entertained new motions regarding how to resume that compendious trial. Some council members either had second thoughts themselves, as one might wish, or else were persuaded by a Diodotus-like person, or persons, to condemn the assumed guilty 8, if that was indeed the people's judgment, but only after proper individual hearings in proper courts. That, however, that was a motion that the council put forward. That was rejected by the Assembly's third resolution, to continue the collective trial in the ecclesia toward a unitary verdict, and surely a blanket condemnation of the 8 for capital impiety and crime. Fourth resolution, provisionally to accept an amendment to add 2 defendants, whom historian Xenophon himself regarded as alone truly culpable, and at last to prescribe the legally required individual trials of all 10. But then came a fifth resolution, ultimately to reject that amendment. The 2 guilty people were not part of the trial, and all of the 8 would be tried together in the assembly. The sixth resolution was in the form of a judgment. They rendered a verdict of guilty with capital penalty. Hemlock, the familiar means of execution, for the 6 present and under arrest in Athens, and confiscation of the property of all 8. Now, those 2 actually guilty captains, if we trust Xenophon, I do, walked away free. Seventh resolution, not many days later, to invite prosecution of demagogues who deceived the people into all those now duly regretted illegalities. Thousands of people had second thoughts. Eighth resolution, including a de facto judgment to arrest and imprison 5 alleged violators, the demagogues, who, however, escaped and fled during a brief period of open uncivil strife, violence, stasis, that adherents of theirs, though now only a fraction of the citizen body, fomented. A conclusion. Direct rule by all classes of citizens in assembly repeatedly showed how any statesman less majestic and other than a Pericles could not control them. And even he, on occasion, could not do so completely. Their inconsistency in policy setting was notorious, as was their adherence to unwritten yet well-established customs and principles, nomoi, collectively, the law, and to written legislation, say fismata, statutes, not to mention abstract decay. They could not be counted on to acknowledge any of these things consistently. Politicians, called rhetores, orators, sometimes appeal to emotions, other times to rational choice, sometimes quite cynical, for all the nation, or to special interest of a significant segment of the nation. Even ostentatiously, they appealed to legality and justice when they were doing its opposite. They strove to be guides or drivers of the demos, demagogoi in its radical sense, indeed. Sometimes I suspect that Cleon had it right when he said that practiced speakers, though hardly himself as blunt as my Mr. President Trump, used showy devices that would win points from an audience who seemed to enjoy political debate as just another kind of contest, like dramatic and athletic competitions that entertained them on days when the courts and the ecclesia, also entertaining, did not sit. Today's political campaigning, spectacularly, though not uniquely in the U.S., seems to be an ignoble descendant of this embarrassing syndrome. That's it. Thank you for your attention. If you have any questions, comments, this is your time. They can be asked or raised in Serbian, of course, and translated for me, or formulated in English if you would do me that favor. I thank you for the favor of listening to me in my first and only really usable language.
I think it's all clear.
It's all clear.
Especially the conclusion.
Mm-hmm. Well, it...
Is direct democracy possible today?
It can be less indirect, thanks, unfortunately, to social media. A political movement can be started and accelerated by the social media, not by the fake liberal media, but by sometimes rather secret sources. Foreign sources have been suspected of influencing not the entire American electorate a year ago, but chosen constituencies in a number of states whose electoral votes gave victory to our present president. But direct democracy, however, where, say, everybody would be voting electronically at the same time after hearing the same discussion, I suppose it's technically possible, but I don't think anybody would ever establish it, especially if it was subject to the same kind of revisiting the next day, or even later the same day. Direct democracy has a manifestation in the referendum that a number of tyrannical leaders in the 19th century, I'm not aware of any before that, but several in the 19th century and well into the 20th, tyrannical rulers have used referenda to establish themselves in power, to give themselves imperial titles, or to suspend constitutions. That kind of thing is happening in Venezuela, for example. I don't think it'll ever happen in my country, but then I didn't think we could elect.
Are we, if hypothetically, они более для нас, как теоретически, как феминизм, поставить директна демократия, да би имал висше или manje negativnih posljedica nego
If there were
theoretical or technical possibilities to instate the direct democracy, do you think it would provoke more or less negative consequences, or more or less negative events? Or
no, more. Certainly more. Because there would be an argument about what facts were made available to the people before they pressed their yes or their no. And so control of media, the liberal, fake enemies of the people, according to one person and his followers, or those who speak the truth, alternative facts maybe. Control of the media will be important. And there are signs in my country and in some others that certain forces that I find suspicious, certain forces are trying to accumulate television networks, cable networks, other media groups, print media, trying to control newspapers. There are some people who are trying to acquire our one important newspaper in Colorado, whom I would not trust to be journalistically conscientious, but rather to be advancing political agenda. And it's happening elsewhere. I don't think anybody will be able to buy out the New York Times, but you know, New York and California are not enough between them to prevent re-election of somebody.
Samo ako možete početi malo usnije. Are there any other historical examples of direct democracy except the Hellenic and those in Greece, in ancient Greece?
Well, you have actually, yes, something like that works at the level of the canton in Switzerland. But Switzerland is about as, there are three different points here. There's the Athenian democracy, there's the American Constitution, a republican form of government with some democratic features. And then there's a canton in Switzerland. They cannot be compared. The scale of the Athenian democracy is exceptional, with many tens of thousands of citizens. Maybe 50,000. I don't know that they could all get together at the Pnyx. You would know more about the topography, whether it's possible for a group that big to gather there. I've never been to Athens myself, but yeah, that's the only one that I know of. There are among some third world peoples, anthropologists, sometimes with a kind of romantic, idyllic notion of how first peoples behaved socially, would say that there was direct democracy there. It's also possible, I suppose, to say that the Germanic tribes of the great Völkerwanderung of the first millennium AD had a kind of direct democracy. The German tribes would elect their war king, and various villages in first peoples, third world communities did apparently choose their leader by consent, if not by voting. But I think our understanding of political process is anachronistically applied to the to tribes and villages in non-Western, even not second world countries or societies. But direct involvement of everyone in every decision is probably never achieved. There's usually, I think, even in the most primitive population, there's somebody who makes decisions on the spot and doesn't refer every decision that he or she makes to every member of the community. There's always some delegation. It may be delegation focused on one person, like those various tyrants who win referenda, giving them absolute power, or a number of representatives, a kind of tribal council of elders or something, given responsibility to make decisions, to advise the person who has the ultimate executive power, or sometimes there could be a collective executive, but the executive could never be the entire population. But yet it almost was at Athens. It almost was at Athens. They were Supreme Court, chief executive, legislative body, the tripartite division of government powers that the U.S. Constitution and many another embodies is all in that sovereign assembly. They were everything. They could instruct the executive. Generals were elected, and generals had to fight the wars that the assembly approved.
That's it. Well, thank you once again.
No.
Hvala također i svima prisutnima. To je to što se tiče decembra mjeseca. Biće vjerovatno još aktivnosti u januaru, pa ćemo o tome